Hey quilters, Sarah here from Snugglebug Stitching. This is part of our Framed Pinwheels quilt along. This Framed Pinwheels pattern is by Missouri Star Quilt Company. I have the link to the pattern in the description. So we're about to cut our pieces, and before I get started showing you how to cut our pieces, a couple things to talk about here. So this pattern for the foreground is going to deal all in 5-inch squares, and even the squares that you use for your pinwheels are going to be 5-inch squares, and those are a little bit big. But the nice thing about that is, one, it simplifies the cutting because you don't have to worry about cutting some of the pieces into 5-inch squares and some of the pieces into 4 3/4-inch squares. You can just cut them all the same size. And another thing it helps with is that is going to give you plenty of wiggle room when you go to trim down your half square triangles. Now, about those half square triangles, they are going to be 4 at a time half square triangles. And if you have done a lot of quilting, you know that 4 at a time half square triangles have bias edges. So that is going to make those edges a little bit stretchier, and you may want to do something to stabilize those. So typically I would use just a whole lot of starch when I press these, and most of the time I would press and starch my fabric before I cut into it. But in this case, with using layer cake squares, I prefer not to do that. And the reason for that is when I starch my fabric, I spray it down liberally with the starch, let it soak in a few minutes, and then iron the fabric until the starch dries. But with layer cake squares, it is too easy to distort the shape of the squares doing it that way. Now, if I had more wiggle room in cutting my layer cake squares, so if I was cutting 2 8x4 pieces, I'd have plenty of wiggle room. I wouldn't necessarily care that those were distorted because I'd still be able to get my cuts. But since I'm cutting these into 4 5-inch squares, I can't really distort the shape of my square like that and still get all the cuts that I need to get. Now, I could spray those down, let them soak, and then press, and keep going around, pressing all the spots until I got it dry. But honestly, that would take forever, and I'm not that patient. So I am not going to starch these at first. I am going to show you a few ways that you can stabilize those later after the half square triangles are made, and I'll show you that during the week where we make half square triangles. So let's get into our cutting demo. I've got my 18x24 cutting mat here, and I have one of my layer cake squares. I have my rotary cutter. This is Olga by Missouri Star Quilt Company, and a 12.5-inch ruler. So the first thing we're going to do is we are going to cut our 35 layer cake squares that we chose. We're going to cut those into 4 5-inch squares. So I am going to actually be sure and cut super precise squares. So instead of just 5 inches here and then 5 inches here, I'm going to actually trim this block down to a perfect 10 inches first. You would think that 10-inch layer cake squares are standardized, but they're not. If you want to hear more about that, you can watch my pre-cut tips video. But we're going to cut these down, trim this down to a perfect 10 inches first before we trim it into 5 inches. That's just going to make your life a lot easier as far as matching your pieces up when you go to make your blocks. So I'm going to get my 10-inch line in this direction and my 10-inch line in this direction, and I'm going to have that within these 2 edges. Now, if you cannot get this so that your pinked edges, the valleys of those pinked edges are not cutting into the 10 inches, that's okay. They're not going to dig deep enough in that to make a difference. So make sure those 10-inch lines are within the layer cake on this side, And you want this side, these edges of the ruler, to be within the layer cake as well. So the first thing we're going to do, now that we have that lined up, going to hold pressure, and I'm going to trim this right side as well as the top. And I did just change my rotary cutter blade, so this should give us a nice clean cut, and those trim offs peel away without any trouble. So now I'm going to leave this layer cake square where it is. I'm not going to pick it up and try to turn it around and realign it. I'm just going to grab my 18 by 24 cutting mat and flip that around. So now that that is flipped around, we're going to grab that ruler again, and I'm going to take the 10-inch line in this direction and the 10-inch line in this direction and line it up, line those lines up with these sides that I just squared off. And once you have those lined up nicely, hold firm pressure again and trim the side and top just like we did before. All right, so nice sharp rotary cutter blade. These trimmings peel away easily without any trouble. So now that that's done, we're going to cut this into 4 5-inch squares. So I'm going to take my 5-inch line and line it up with this side. Once that's lined up, firm pressure, make a cut. I'm going to leave those exactly where they are, and I'm going to flip this mat around again. All right, and then I'm going to take the 5-inch line on my ruler again and line it up with this other side. Alrighty, and we're going to make that cut. And now we have 4 nicely cut 5-inch squares, and you will do that with all 35 of your layer cake squares that you selected. I'm going to go ahead and do that, and I will meet you back here and show you what to do next. Now that we have all of our 35 layer cake squares cut down into 4 5-inch squares each, before we cut our charms to 5 inches, we are going to start thinking ahead a little bit to the half square triangle step, and we are going to choose which fabrics that we want to use for our pinwheels. So looking at these fabrics that I have here, I am not going to use either of these white prints as a pinwheel, and that's just because they'll be cut into such small pieces. The fact that there is a yellow print on this instead of just solid white won't show up as well against these white on white prints, so we won't use those. And looking at these here, this pretty green print and this nice black print, since the prints are a little bit bigger and that will not show up as well in the tiny pieces for the half square triangles, we will not use those for pinwheels. And this one too, same thing here. They're kind of spaced out, so the fact that they're not just solid black and these pretty flower prints will not show up as well in tiny half square triangle pieces, so we will not use those for pinwheels. And these two right here, and there's a yellow one like that too. These prints here, these medium-sized prints, would be fine in half square triangles most of the time if they were some of our smaller prints. But since I've got plenty of smaller prints here left, I'm not going to use these just because these florals will not show up as well in tiny half square triangles. So this is what I have left to work with. Now that I've decided which ones I don't want to use for pinwheels, I can pick 40 squares to make my pinwheels with. So what I will just do is just go through and try to get a good mix of the different prints in there when picking my 40. So what you'll do with these, whatever 40 prints you want to use for your pinwheels, we're going to stack each of those right sides together with one of your white on white prints. So let me just clear my station here and I'm going to show you what we're going to do. So we're not going to cut this one first because watch this. This is going to be a little bit bigger. This white on white print is going to be a little bit bigger than these 5-inch squares that we cut down to the right size. So we're going to stack those right sides together with 40 of these, with whatever 40 we pick up here. And it doesn't matter that they're not the same size, because with the 4 times half square triangle technique, we're just going to sew a 1/4 inch seam around the edges. And you'll just sew this with the smaller side up and just use the edges of this perfectly trimmed 5-inch square as where you start your seam allowance. And then you will end up squaring this down anyway, so it doesn't really matter. So since I don't actually have to have these white on white prints as perfect 5-inch squares, I'm not going to take the time to cut them that way. Okay, so now that I have all 40 of my stacks made, each stack makes 1 pinwheel, so there'll be 40 pinwheels in this quilt. I'm going to just kind of keep these together and set them aside. And the next thing to do will be to trim our background squares. So coming from Charms, same deal as with the layer cake squares. If you think 5 inches would be 5 inches, but that's not standardized. So just to make this easier on myself, I'm going to go ahead and trim these. So we're going to take the 5-inch line here and the 5-inch line here and have it within this square. And you can trim more than one at a time if you feel comfortable doing so. Alrighty, and we're going to rotate my 18 by 24 cutting mat just like I have been doing with the rest of the demo. These are not going to go in pinwheels. These other squares are not going to go in pinwheels. So we're going to trim them down just to make it easier on ourselves later when we go to match these up. So now we have nice trimmed 5-inch squares ready to go, and we will trim 40 of those. So you should have 4 squares from your 2 background square charm packs left over when you're done trimming. So while we are cutting pieces, let me just go ahead and show you how to cut the borders. These are my techniques that I like to use. If you don't like them, feel free to do whatever you want to. Now that we have all our 5-inch squares cut and our pinwheel fabrics stacked and ready to go, the next thing to do while we're here cutting, we're going to go ahead and cut our pieces for our border. So first we've got the outer border, and the pattern is going to tell you to cut 7 6-inch strips. So what I've done here, I have my fabric pressed and I have it folded selvage to selvage, and at the bottom, at this part where it folds, I have pressed a hard crease, and I'm going to use that to line up with the lines on my mat. So I have this lined up with the 1/2-inch mark on my cutting mat. And a good way to test this, I'm going to use my 6 by 24 ruler, but a good way to test this is to line up that ruler with your inch marks. I'm going to line up with the 1-inch mark at the top and the bottom. Line that up, and while you're lining that up, you want to be able to have a mark line up with this bottom part of the crease, as well as having these vertical lines line up with the lines. And that's just a good check to make sure you have that lined up correctly. So I have my first cut lined up on the 1-inch mark. So I'm going to go ahead and make that cut. And Then we're going to move down to the 7-inch mark. So I started on 1 instead of the 0 just because that gives me a little bit more room on the side to run my rotary cutter. So we're going to go to 7 next. And remember that test. You want a horizontal line to line up with that fold line on the end, as well as having your vertical lines lined up with the markings on the mat. And then we're going to add 6, so 7 plus 6 is 13. So our next place we're going to cut is at the 13-inch mark. Remember, check your alignments. All right, and that is as far as I have that I can cut on my 18 by 24 cutting mat. So now that that's done, I'm going to take these 2 strips and I'm going to square off the top. So basically trim off those selvages so that these are ready to use. So for this, your measurement check that you are looking for is you're going to take a horizontal line and line it up with this side here that we just squared off. And you should be able to line it up with this side as well as your line markings. And we're just going to cut as close to that selvage as we can without cutting into it. I'm just going to peel this up a little bit and check to make sure I'm not cutting into the selvage. And those are all trimmed off and ready to use for our border, and we'll repeat that until we get all our 7 strips. So I have my 6 by 24 ruler here, and I have my fabric for my inner border. Now I do already have this pressed and folded selvage to selvage, and at the bottom I'm going to go ahead and just kind of finger press that crease, and we're going to line this up so that it looks close to these lines, but they don't have to be exact, and we're pretty much going to be ignoring the lines on our cutting mat in this case. So you're going to take your ruler, and I've got my 18 by 24 inch cutting mat here. You're going to take your ruler and you're going to line one of these horizontal lines up with this bottom edge that's kind of finger pressed. So you're going to line up with that instead of worrying about lining it up with the lines on your mat. And that's just going to make it so that you don't have a weird, not straight piece in the middle of your border. And I'm just making sure here that when I cut, I'll be catching both layers of this. So I'm going to go ahead and make a cut to the right here. All right. Now that I've made that cut, I'm going to flip my mat to the other side. Just move my camera angle a little bit there so that you can see what I'm going to do next. All right. So I've got this edge that I just squared off, and I'm going to take the 2.5 inch line and line it up with that edge that I just squared off. Not necessarily worrying about what the lines on our mat look like. Just line it up with that edge that I just squared off. All right. And then you'll move this out of the way. And we're going to keep making 2.5 inch cuts until we have all 6 of our strips cut. Once you have all 6 of your strips cut, make sure that your edges are folded and together neatly. Then we're going to take a line on your mat and we're going to line that edge up with the line on your mat. We're going to do about 3 of them at a time. I'm just going to stack these as neatly as I can. And once they are stacked neatly, I'm going to grab a ruler and I'm going to line a horizontal line up with this line at the bottom. And make sure that's nice and square, and we're going to trim off our selvages. We're going to take our ruler as close to the selvages as we can without cutting into them, keeping that line on your ruler in line with the line on your strips. Trim that off. Keep doing that until you get them all trimmed.